When We Disagree is a show about arguments, how we have them, why we have them, and their impact on our relationships and ourselves. Status differences can complicate any conversation. Imagine two friends planning a road trip. One has been on dozens of cross-country adventures, while the other rarely ventures beyond their hometown. The experienced traveler might dominate the planning, assuming their knowledge is superior. But what if the novice really has a knack for finding hidden roadside gems and quaint diners and cute bookstores and kitschy bars, and even more? If the conversation is tilted by perceived expertise, the trip might miss out on real fun. This is where the concept of bracketed status differences is important. In an ideal public sphere theorized by many writers, citizens temporarily set aside their social rank, their wealth, and their expertise when they debate each other. In other words, they debate as equals. They show evidence rather than assert it. Everyone's voice is treated relatively equally. That doesn't mean that everybody is right, and it certainly doesn't mean that everybody has a valid point of view, or that their arguments are true, but the focus shifts from who is speaking to what is being said. Think about family gatherings. Maybe there's an uncle who's a doctor and weighs in on every health-related topic, but the youngest cousin is in a biology class and brings up some really new research that she learned in college. In a free and fair conversation, the cousin wouldn't be casually dismissed for lacking credentials. Instead, the argument itself, the research she shared, would be scrutinized. Did the data hold up? Is the reasoning sound? Bracketing status differences is, of course, much easier said than done. Power dynamics tend to creep in. Picture a workplace meeting where a junior employee has a groundbreaking idea. Even if it's brilliant, the CEO might brush it aside, while a more senior manager making essentially the same suggestion could get applause. When status trumps substance, good ideas can get lost. But when people consciously create a space where status is bracketed, conversations can change. It's not about pretending we don't have different backgrounds or experiences. It's about refusing to let those differences hijack the pursuit of a collective decision. I'm Michael Lee, Professor of Communication and Director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. Our guest today on When We Disagree is Kurt Gray. Kurt is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he directs the Deepest Beliefs Lab and the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. His latest book is Outrage: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. Kurt, tell us an argument story.
Well, I try not to have so many arguments because my whole shtick is moral understanding, but I'll tell you about a kind of exciting conversation about morality. So I took an Uber ride to the airport. The driver asked what I do. I told him I study morality and politics, and he said, well, here's what I think about morality and politics. I'm a Christian nationalist, but not the typical kind. And so what I could have done was say, well, I don't agree with Christian nationalism, but instead what I asked, and I asked questions, was, well, what does that mean? I've never met a Christian nationalist, let alone an atypical one. So he told me his views on the church, the state, the family. I asked lots of questions. I felt like I really understood the nuances of his argument. And then as we're getting closer to the airport, maybe 20 minutes later, we start, I guess, having a disagreement about abortion. And he likened all those who are pro-choice to the Gestapo, to Nazis. And I teach a class on how to have better disagreements, on how to have moral understanding. And I stopped him after that, Nazi comparison. And I said, hold up, we can't have a conversation about politics and morality, good-natured, well-meaning one, if you compare half the country to the Nazis. And then he did something that people rarely do, which is he said, I'm sorry, let me take that back. I was just trying to say this kind of slippery slope idea that if you don't respect fetal life, you don't respect other life. But the fact that he could take a step back and apologize, and as I left the Uber, we shook each other's hands, and it's clear that we didn't agree with each other, but it's clear that we respected our positions. And he, as a Christian nationalist, who probably was predisposed not to like more progressive academics like the folks I hang out with, I think also kind of respected my position. So I think that's a great example of a
Mhm.
topic and an issue that could really create disagreement, and we still disagree, right? But the way I approached it was something that fostered respect and common ground.
I'm curious about the first thing you said before we get into the weeds of the atypical Christian nationalist, who apparently is a very capable Uber driver as well, because you got there safely amidst a pretty rancorous argument, which is that you said you try not to have these memorable arguments because of your whole shtick is about understanding. How do you juxtapose those two? And your story gets into that as well. Is a world of understanding a world without argument, or is a world of argument a world with lots of misunderstanding?
I think you can have lots of disagreements with people, right? And I think like that's the world we live in. We live in a pluralistic democracy where there's folks on the left and folks on the right and more besides. And I think disagreement and discussion are all essential and all inevitable, but I don't think the kind of rancorous arguments, right, that come to mind of like shouting and spittle coming out of your mouth and red face. I mean, I think that's often what we think about when we think of disagreement, but it doesn't have to be that. It's not that in my classes, and it's not that when I talk to folks. And so I think I can imagine like a better kind of disagreement than we often think about.
That's right. Okay. So a world of understanding still has inevitable disagreements. The temperature is just taken down.
That's right. We're disagreeing about ideas. We're not thinking that the person we're disagreeing with is a monster, right? I think so often in political discourse today, we think, well, you know, you're trying to burn it all down, and I'm the only one in this conversation who's trying to protect our families or America. And I think, my research shows that that's absolutely wrong, right? People are motivated, everyone's motivated by this desire for protection and the desire to kind of like uphold their values, but we seldom recognize that. At the same time, there's ways to help us recognize that. And when we do, I think conversations go much better, right? When we strive for understanding instead of, victories. Because let's be honest, no one ever gives up, their moral convictions at the end of one of these conversations, but we enter them thinking that people will. Of course, we will never do that, but we think the other person will. And I think that's just a crazy assumption to make. Like if you wouldn't do it, then they wouldn't do it. And so let's strive for understanding.
And when you give the advice to strive for understanding rather than victories, are you saying that in the kind of Uber example with the atypical Christian nationalist, where this is a one-off conversation? And so you know that you have a limited relationship, if a mostly non-existent relationship with this one-time person. And so in this moment, let's strive for understanding. But you and I have a consistent relationship, perhaps, and you have come to a belief that I find monstrous, but I would like to sustain our relationship and think there's some value in getting you to change your mind. Would you say that I could strive for both understanding and victory over the long term?
I think when people have one-off interactions, maybe understanding isn't as important, right? And I'm so committed to understanding, I will try to understand an Uber driver for 20 minutes instead of playing on my phone, right? Or like zoning out and looking at the window.
Mm-hmm.
But, the book Outraged and all the work that I do is really about these are people you want to have a relationship with, your coworkers, your family member, right? Those are especially the times you should strive for understanding because you want to reestablish those relationships. And it turns out that if you want to persuade folks in the long run, then what you need to do is first understand them, right? You need to understand where they're at. You need to meet them where they're at. And only then is persuasion possible, right? So I think understanding is even more important when you actually have a relationship with someone.
So in that world, it's not understanding versus victory. It's that understanding precedes victory, at least persuasive victory.
Exactly. Right. Because if you come to this conversation stuck in your head and you're like, oh, I'm just gonna throw these facts at someone that I heard on NPR, and that's gonna somehow defeat them, and they'll be like, oh, I give up my view on abortion because of these talking points you threw at me. I guess you're right. I mean, that has never happened in a conversation ever in the world, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so instead, I think if you want to convince someone that you have a reasonable position, then I think the way to do that is to understand in their mind the reasonableness of their position and then kind of pull them closer again by meeting someone where they're at, not just assuming that everything that they think is wrong.
When I try this line of argument, and it is one that I deeply believe in, when I try it in front of audiences, if I'm giving talks on dialogue and debate and how to depolarize, how to be persuasive, the two pushbacks I most often get, and I'm curious as to your response because you've researched this question so much, is are you giving up on the fact, right? Are you giving up on the idea of facts when you start with a position of common ground and you hear somebody out who's saying things that you know to be false, and the consensus amongst experts is that this is false? And then second, when you seek to understand, is that naturally slipping into seeking to validate, to affirm as well? And so, in other words, are you platforming and tacitly agreeing with these ideas if you seek to understand them first?
Maybe I'll answer the second question first about the tacit agreement in understanding. I do think there is some validation. I do think there is some sense that people need to feel like they're heard and their views are respected so that they can feel comfortable, shifting their perspective, as I did with the Uber driver, right? If I argued against him for 20 minutes that he's wrong and an idiot and evil, then he wouldn't have apologized and taken back the invocation of the Nazis, right? And so I think affirming someone like, I understand how you could think that, especially given, your experiences growing up, right? Your other values. I think that is a kind of very person-centric understanding. It's not saying that your position is right. You can even say, right, I don't agree with that position politically, but I understand kind of like the reasons why you might, be drawn to that position. So I think that's a little different than just kind of validating the general position as much as their experience. Then the second question about facts, it's a good one. I mean, sometimes there's disagreement about like which facts are most relevant. So take guns. I grew up in Canada, no handguns. I'm not really into, the existence of handguns. But there is a fact of the matter that some people have used guns to defend themselves and their family. You can see stories of this on the internet. You can read stories about this. And so when someone says, look, I'm pro gun rights because I want to have a gun and protect my family, I can say, think of all the times that, kids die because of guns that are not protected or whatever. But they might say, well, I'm a very careful gun owner and I'm doing it to protect my family. And so their kind of statistics, I think, are on my side, but they can marshal statistics that show that many people use guns in self-defense. So I think the issue is more complicated than we think about it. Of course, there's other issues like I think vaccines, right? As a scientist, I'm pro-vaccines, that I think the facts are really squarely in our corner as scientists. And there I think, well, facts do matter, but again, the only way you're going to convince people pragmatically, right, practically, is by striving to understand their feelings, their opposition to vaccines, meeting them where they're at, and then trying to pull them along. It's not, you can't start with being like, well, you're an idiot. That's not the truth. That's not the facts. That's not going to change anyone's mind. So I think my goals are really pragmatic, even if we think that, the facts are clear.
I'm struck by a kind of asymmetry in terms of the way that people are persuaded between what you're suggesting and many people are suggesting, and you're on the show now, so we'll talk about your position, but it is kind of a part of a larger dialogue-based movement of mutual understanding. And the way that mass persuasion, even radicalization, happens around issues. So let's just say you and I were having a discussion about how many people have been persuaded in the past 5 years that there's something nefarious going on, something really risky going on with vaccines. And would you say that persuasive process has been a fairly rational process based on mutual understanding, perspective taken, and respect given? No, it's a process largely driven by fear-based arguments, right? Radical arguments. This is going to hurt you. This is going to hurt your kids. You're going to die. There's something secret in these things. And then the antidote, you're saying, is respect and understanding and coming at them, not fight fear with fear. Say, no,
that's right.
These are going to save your life. You're going to die if you don't take these. That's not what you're saying.
Well, right. I think I'm saying, of course, these persuasion tactics rely on fears and worries about harms because that's how our moral mind operates. I have more than a decade of research that suggests every single moral judgment we make is grounded in perceptions of harm. That underlies all of our moral and political convictions. But those perceptions of harm are intuitive and visceral, right? And so you can't come out with someone with a rational argument dispelling their kind of visceral fears. So if I ask you to put a fork in an outlet, right, and I say, trust me, the outlet's turned off, you're going to hesitate before you stick the fork in the electric outlet, right? Because you get this visceral sense like, I don't know. Or if you're afraid of flying and you're sweating and twitching as there's turbulence, and I say, you know what, actually, it's super safe, but then the plane drops 100 feet in the air,
Right.
and everyone gives a little shout. You still have the feeling, and I can't say, well, you're stupid. You're stupid. It's safe to fly. Like, just get over it. Instead, I need to say, I understand you're really afraid, and it's super frightening when there's turbulence, and you meet someone where they're at, and then you can marshal the statistics of like, well, here's some facts about planes you maybe didn't know, right? And so it doesn't mean dispel the facts entirely, but it means you first have to kind of acknowledge people's intuitions and their visceral fears.
Yeah, and I guess my point is that when we wade into these debates, let's say it's about vaccines or something, then the folks who are saying that X is really bad for you, you think it's good, but it's really bad for you, are using a bazooka of fear. And here, the recommendation, at least from the other side, seems to be we come in with scalpels of moral understanding.
I think that's right. I mean, I think it's also useful to recognize that our minds operate on the idea of stories instead of statistics. We're like storytelling creatures. And with vaccines, there are actual real stories of people being harmed through vaccines. It's not typical, right? But it is very real, those stories. And if you anchor on those stories, like that's the bazooka, right? You're like, well, here's this case of terribleness, and I put something in my child's body and it hurt them or it killed them. And so the fear of kind of you might catch a disease statistically if you don't get this, and it might be stronger if you don't get this, right? I think that's harder to grasp than this real story. And so that's part of meeting people where they're at, is recognizing the power of stories. And I don't think that we need to surrender all of our facts, obviously, to that story, but recognize its power and the power to like viscerally create fear. And I think once you kind of meet people where they're at there, then I think you can try to like marshal these other fears as well, but never through a "are you stupid" kind of attitude.
Yeah, well said. And to that point, we're talking about kind of norms of exchange, norms of decorum, how we should talk to one another, fear-based arguments versus these kind of moral understanding scalpels. It draws me back to a question I was thinking of about earlier when you were in this Uber argument with the atypical Christian nationalists, which is when the Christian nationalist driver started comparing those who were pro-choice to the Gestapo. And then inevitably apologized, it sounds like, and kind of walked that line back a little bit. Taking that more broadly, under what circumstances is it appropriate, or is it wise from a persuasive point of view, or is it moral, perhaps, to draw that boundary and say, no, I think this is really morally monstrous, and include an epithet, a label like that? Maybe it's not the Nazis, but it's something else. Or make that kind of a slippery slope argument. Like, I think your position on this issue licenses all sorts of moral monstrosities that you haven't considered.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think we need to consider what's the purpose of this conversation that you're having with someone. Are you trying to persuade them, or are you trying to just establish, your moral convictions? And if you're just trying to say, well, here's what I believe, then maybe it makes sense to make that strong argument, right? But I don't think there's a world in which anyone's better off in a one-on-one conversation where you're trying to kind of pull people towards your viewpoint when you suggest that they're in league with the Nazis. Right. I mean, especially if family members, coworkers, right? You're at the water cooler. You're like, what are you, Hitler? Right. I don't think that's going to help. I do think it's important, however, to distinguish conversations with everyday people, 99% who are well-meaning and like just trying to make the right choice for themselves and their family, with some political elites, right? So I don't think, you need to have like a deep well of compassion for, let's say, Elon Musk. Right. I think the majority of Americans aren't thinking like, wow, I really want to understand him and have a compassion for his perspectives when he's, maybe slashing Social Security or whatever. Right. Like no one voted for Elon. And so I don't think we need to worry about him as much. But I think everyday people, I think we really need to resist the urge to think that they're motivated to destroy and that they see themselves as Nazis. Right. Everyone is just trying to kind of do their best for themselves and their family.
One big question as we close, and a question about curiosity about your reactions to your research. You've been really researching persuasion and moral understanding for a hot minute, and you've collected it into this book, Outraged. What's something that's really surprised you along the way? Either a finding or a recommendation, a study?
I think I've been studying this for a long time and collecting lots of data. But I think what maybe most surprised me is the kind of first third of the book in Moral and Outraged, and that's about our kind of human nature. And this is something that I didn't research directly, but really read about. And we assume that humans evolved as predators, as apex predators, and it turns out that we were much more hunted than hunter, prey than predator. And, thinking of how we evolved millions of years ago might seem far away from moral conflict today. But I think what really gets me interested in this is like, there's like really a direct link, right? We're so afraid in our past of getting eaten by saber-toothed cats and our kids getting picked off by eagles and devoured in nests. That's like deep within our minds, right? And so today we're maybe safer from wild animals, although if you went into the forest, at dusk and no one was around, you might still get creeped out. But today we still have this kind of fear, this threat, and we can't help but like trigger these fears. So even if we're super safe today in a relative sense, right? There's less crime, there's no wild animals, we still project these fears and threats onto the world and worry about them. And so I think that's important for folks to keep in mind, right? Like no matter how safe you actually are, you can't help but worry about these threats. And so political leaders capitalize on that to make us afraid, but also we can capitalize that in conversation to help us understand each other.
Yeah, it's an evolutionary notion, and it's also a Burkean notion, Edmund Burke, in that sense, that human beings have this contradictory nature, motivated by massive negativity, biases, and fear can lead us to be awestruck by power and things that make us feel safe, but it can also make us deeply empathetic and social animals who need to cooperate to better our individual and collective lives.
Exactly, right? We all rely on community to flourish and to thrive. And those community bonds are fractured today by politics. And I think the way to kind of reestablish that community is by, striving for understanding and recognizing that people are motivated by, protecting themselves from the fears they see.
Kurt Gray, thank you so much for being on When We Disagree.
Thanks for having me.
When We Disagree is recorded at the College of Charleston with creator and host Michael Lee. Recording and sound engineering by Jesse Kunz and Lance Laidlaw. Reach out to us at whenwedisagree@gmail.com.